Talk to anyone who's ever been interviewed by a journalist and you're going to find a common complaint. They can't believe that out of the whole interview, only a short snippet made it to air. It's extremely frustrating as a source to make time for this entire interview, and then out of that whole thing, only one or two sentences actually make it into the story. But being able to take a whole conversation and focus the audience's attention on one or two key points takes a lot of skill, judgment, and of course, practice. Here's what you should look for in a soundbite. First of all, you're working with time constraints, and it's something that you're going to have to deal with. In radio, for an RA, or even for a radio package, you're going to want to stick to between 10 and 15 seconds for a soundbite. Now, soundbites are often a little bit longer in radio than they are in TV, and we don't do a ton of radio in this sequence. So I encourage you to stick with the 10 to 15 second rule for the sake of consistency. Just know that in radio, soundbites do tend to go a little bit longer, sometimes up to 20 seconds. But in TV, we're very strict about that 10 to 15 second rule. The only exception would be in a situation where the entire context of the soundbite is important. Like if a politician says something controversial and he claims he misspoke, then the entire clip might be worth playing. You also want to use soundbites for things that you can't just say yourself. If the source says something bland or just provides details, well, you as a journalist can paraphrase that. That's part of your job, and you can do it in a much more compelling way. Save your sound bites for situations where a source is providing an opinion or personal experience. Or in the case of an expert source, maybe they have a really clear and compelling way of explaining something that's just far better than anything that you could have written. This should go without saying, but make sure your soundbite is a fair representation of the rest of the interview. We definitely don't want to make the source sound out of context or misrepresent their views in any way. And you were there for the full interview, so you know best what's fair and what's an accurate representation of their views. And also, don't always go for the shiny object. I mean, sometimes we fall into this habit of picking sound bites that sound really good to the ear, but they don't actually have any substance to them. Like they'll say something clever and it fits neatly into a 12-second template, but it's just not conveying anything you couldn't have otherwise said yourself. PR people are really good at speaking in sound bites, so you're going to have to work at it to get something that doesn't sound canned. Okay, here is the format that we use for one soundbite in radio.
For KBIA in Columbia, I'm Corey Davidson. The University of Missouri will not remove a statue of Thomas Jefferson in the Francis Quadrangle, the Columbia Missourian reports. In a statement released today, UM System President Moon Choi says, quote, "After further discussion with other curators, the university decided not to remove the Jefferson statue. We learn from history, we contextualize historical figures with complex legacies. We don't remove history." The decision comes after a meeting with several members of MU's Legion of Black Collegians and university leaders. The university says in the statement that they hope to continue conversations instead of removing the statue. Sophomore Roman Leapart started the petition to remove the statue and says the university made its stance clear in the meeting.
I want them to stop having conversations and start doing actions into certain things, because the students are tired of conversations, and we see that tweeted over and over again because we've been having conversations for a long time.
Leapart says he sees the statue's removal as an issue of sexual assault, given Jefferson's relationship with his slave Sally Hemings, who birthed 6 of his children.
So this is called an RA, or a reader actuality. Here's the copy formatted for a radio script. This was a long one, and I think it could have been cut down quite a bit, but like I've said before, radio stories do tend to be a bit longer than TV stories. I thought this was a good example because it was very likely written by a student. KBIA is the NPR affiliate at my alma mater, Mizzou, and about 90% of the staff at that station are journalism students. So, sorry the font is small, the script was long, but you can see here the basic format for an RA. You've got reporter or anchor copy, a clip or soundbite, usually followed by a little more reporter copy. We'll talk more about this format in a little bit, and there are, of course, examples in the tip sheet, so you don't have to worry about screenshotting this. If we break it down, here's what we get. The first sentence is your hard news lead. Focus on whatever W's are most important and lead with what's new and what's now. In your second sentence, support the lead. Include any key details you had to leave out of the lead, and this is usually where attribution is going to go. Another tactic for the second sentence is to go back to the start of the story and tell things chronologically. In one of your practice assignments, the Red Robber story, this would be a good way to do it. Next, you want to provide additional details. Remember, these are your nuggets. You should have all those nuggets in a bullet point format so that you can just plug them into your script and then dress them up a little bit. In radio, you might have the lead plus 2 to 4 additional sentences of information before you get to number 4 here, which is where you lead into the soundbite. We're going to talk more about this in a second, but in radio, when you lead into a soundbite, you almost always want to say the source's name, and you do not want to simply parrot whatever the listener is about to hear the source say. So more on that in a second. The clip lead-in is followed by the clip, obviously. I like these to be 10 to 15 seconds. Sometimes they are up to 20 in radio. You should stick with 10 to 15. Then, once the clip is over, we come back to the anchor or reporter and they provide another nugget or two. This is called a tag. Ideally, it's forward-looking information, so think of it this way. What happens next in the story? For some stories, that's completely unknown or just not possible, but a lot of things we report on are ongoing or are likely to have future updates. For example, if you're reporting on a massive pileup on the highway, your tag might be something like, investigators aren't sure what caused the crash, but they expect to have more answers within 48 hours. Here's your first general guideline for introducing sound bites. This is especially important in radio because there are no visual cues to let the audience know, hey, this is someone else talking. In TV, we have something called lower thirds or supers, where a source's name is across the bottom of the screen. Well, we don't have that tool in radio, so in most cases, and especially when you're writing an RA, you're going to say the source's name before the clip. Our second guideline is this. Usually, you're going to say the person's title before their name. For example, if I'm doing a story on the incredible popularity of the VCU broadcast journalism program and I'm going to play a clip from my esteemed colleague, Gary Gillum, I'm going to introduce him as VCU journalism professor Gary Gillum. Why? Because as much as I know and love Gary, his name is secondary to his role. His job is why I'm interviewing him for the story. If I lead the sentence off with Gary Gillum, people are going to be like, who? But if I say his title first, people are like, oh, okay, I'm hearing from a journalism professor. So this is your first tactic for introducing sources. It's foolproof. When in doubt, lead into a soundbite by using someone's title followed by their name. Here are some examples. In the train crash story, we might talk to the sheriff's spokesman. Before we play his clip, the copy would read, Hanover County Sheriff spokesman Grayson Witter says crews are working around the clock to stop the spill. In our story about Mr. Muscles, the gym that's closing, we might talk to a trainer who just lost his job, and before that clip, we'd say something like this. Mr. Muscles' employee Carson Grant had no idea his employer was broke. And in a story about a new Richmond rule to require pet owners to register exotic animals, we might talk to the director of the Animal Care and Control. We would introduce her this way. Animal Care and Control Director Christy Paulson says not having a registry has led to some interesting situations. So in all of these examples, it's very simple. Title, name, and a little bit of a wind-up into the soundbite. Here's another example. Say I'm doing a story on voter excitement for the upcoming election, and I talk to a voter named Deborah. I might say, Richmond voter Deborah Dixon says she learned an important lesson in the last election. She doesn't have an official title, but I'm still identifying her role in the story. Here's another one. And this time I'm introducing the source's role in a more indirect way. If I'm doing a story on a car that crashed into a light pole in a local neighborhood, I might write, the car slammed into a light pole right in front of Jeremy Smith's house. He says he heard a screech and then a crash. It's obvious why I'm talking to Jeremy, but I don't really use a title per se. Another option is to use a source's title and not their name. For example, in the exotic registry story, I might introduce the source by saying, Richmond's animal control director says an exotic pet registry is long overdue, and then I play her clip. Using a title without a name is extremely common in TV news because, again, we have a super that gives the audience that information. But in radio, it's less common because if you don't say their name out loud, their name is just not going to be in the story, and the audience really has no idea who's talking. That can be okay in a situation where you say something like, Richmond's mayor says he's thinking about running for governor, because there is only one Richmond mayor, so someone could reasonably figure out who's talking. But if you say, a VCU professor says she is against the tuition increase, then that could be a lot of people. It all comes back to making it clear as possible who the audience is hearing from. Don't make them work for it. Here's a good example of a soundbite lead-in that would work for TV, but not for radio. Again, we're talking about a proposal for an exotic pet registry in Richmond. One council member says he won't vote for the registry unless it's more specific. Now in TV, that's cool because I'll see his name in the super and I'll know who it is. In radio, not cool. Is the audience supposed to recognize his voice? I mean, they have no idea which council person is against this, and that's something that they definitely need to know. Here is a third tactic for introducing sound bites, and this one, again, is better for TV than radio. With radio, that's what I said. You really just need to stick with title and name. It works better 90% of the time. In this example, we're going to use a very general lead-in that gives the audience an idea of who is talking, but not a specific name and not necessarily a specific title. This one is a story about a Piggly Wiggly that's shutting down in Emporia, Virginia. Emporia shoppers will now have to travel at least 30 miles to get to the nearest grocery store. So in radio, I would recommend saying Mary Newman's name, but admittedly, her name is not all that important to the story, so this is called a general lead-in, where you're just stating a general fact. It's a nugget that leads into the soundbite. It's not totally unrelated to the soundbite, but it's not a specific lead-in, and it works really well in TV, and I would not air this for radio. A similar but slightly different tactic is to use the one person says introduction. So same story about the Piggly Wiggly shutting down, but this time I lead into a Mary Newman soundbite by saying, one Emporia shopper says no matter who is to blame, the outcome for her town is the same. Again, I don't give her name, and I probably would if this was a radio story, but the one person says soundbite lead-in is very common, and you can use it. Not my favorite, but it works sometimes. And that brings us to our final tactic, and this one has the potential to be disastrous if you use it incorrectly. Sometimes we lead into sound bites by suggesting that someone speaks for a group. So take the Red Robber example. If we talk to an officer, Myron Neely, and he's from Richmond PD, it's totally fine for us to say this. Police say the suspect was easy enough to track down. When someone talks to you in an official capacity representing where they work, then they do speak for the group. Police are almost always speaking on behalf of their department. They have public information officers that specifically do this. If you talk to VCU's Communications Central Office, then yes, they also speak on behalf of the university. Michael Rao, the VCU president, he speaks on behalf of the university. But if you interview me about the state of journalism education, I do not speak for VCU. So you need to be careful if you imply that someone speaks on behalf of a group. It can be bad. Look at this. Virginia's black women voters say they'll be at the polls regardless of who is on the ballot. And then we have a single soundbite from one Deborah Dixon, who is apparently a black woman voter. And that's not good. Deborah Dixon does not represent all black women voters. I mean, if someone interviewed you about your intention to vote in the election and then implied that you represent or speak for all VCU students, you'd probably think that was ridiculous. So you need to use the speaking for a group soundbite lead-in very carefully, and when you're in doubt, just don't do it. So here's an example where the situation might be a little murky on whether someone speaks for a group. So in our car crashing story, we might lead into the soundbite by saying, neighbors say they woke up to an ear-splitting screech followed by a thundering crash. The question is, does Jeremy, the neighbor, fairly represent the experience of the neighborhood? It depends. If you talk to a few neighbors and they all said, yeah, we woke up to a thundering crash, it was crazy. Well, then sure, Jeremy's experience is an exemplar of what other people told you. I don't have to play multiple sound bites from all of the neighbors to make the same point. But if you talk to a bunch of people and Jeremy is the only one who heard it, then you may as well write one neighbor says instead of suggesting that his experience was shared across others. As for what you should actually say in the lead up to a soundbite, your goal is to prepare the audience for what they're about to hear. That usually means a couple of things. First, don't say, I talked to so-and-so from X company and she says this. You don't have to tell the audience you talked to someone. That's like the core part of your job. You never have to remind them that you sat down with someone or tracked down so-and-so. The second guideline is that you don't want to steal a soundbite. In other words, don't repeat what the source says. It's a waste of script space and it's annoying because the audience listens to the soundbite and thinks, didn't the reporter just say that? One strategy to avoid this is to look at the soundbite in a wider context. Look at what the source said directly before the soundbite you're using, and then you can paraphrase that and use it as your lead-in. Okay, so now that you know how to lead into soundbites, you have all the skills you need to write an RA. This is the general outline, which you'll also find in the tip sheet. And here's an example of what it looks like when it's formatted as a radio script. So you've got all caps for your reporter copy, and the soundbite is formatted like this. You write clip, and then you number it. In an RA, there's only one soundbite, so it'll always be clip number 1. When we get into packages, you'll have multiple clips, so the numbering matters. You also put the source's last name after a backslash. That makes it easier for you and anyone else editing your script to be sure who's talking. Soundbites are in sentence case, meaning regular lowercase with correct capitalization. Put them in quotation marks. And then we come back to reporter copy. Again, this is in all caps. And these last 2 sentences are called the tag. Again, there are a few examples of RAs in the tip sheet, so refer to those as you do your practice assignment.